The Georgia sun was merciless that day, the kind of heat that seemed to crawl inside your skin and settle in your bones. The streets shimmered under the relentless glare, and the air carried a weight that made each breath feel like pulling through syrup. Officer Darren Whitaker leaned against the side of his patrol car, his aviators hiding a pair of restless, watchful eyes. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, but he made no move to wipe it away. His gaze stayed fixed on the passing traffic, each car a potential story, a possible problem. Darren had been with the force for almost 15 years, and in that time, he'd seen his share of what he liked to call trouble. Trouble, in his mind, often wore a certain kind of skin. It wasn't something he'd ever spoken aloud, not in so many words, but it lived in the corners of his thoughts, in the way his muscles tensed when certain faces crossed his path, in the words he chose and the assumptions he made without a second thought. It wasn't something he was proud of, though he never questioned it either. It was a truth passed down, inherited like an old watch or a worn-out leather wallet, from his father and his grandfather before him. He could still hear his old man's voice, rough as gravel, after a few too many beers on a Friday night. "Son, don't you ever let your guard down around their kind. You don't owe them nothing but suspicion." At 12 years old, Darren had nodded solemnly, too young to question, too eager to please. By the time he joined the academy, those words had settled into the marrow of his bones. So when a black SUV glided past him that afternoon, its windows darkened against the sun, Darren's pulse quickened. It wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, wasn't doing anything wrong. But something in the back of his mind whispered, that doesn't belong here. His hand flicked the lights on, siren bleeding out into the heavy afternoon air. The SUV slowed, signal blinking politely, and pulled to the shoulder without hesitation. Darren smirked, feeling the familiar surge of control as he stepped out of his cruiser. The world shrank to the two of them, the hum of cicadas and distant traffic fading beneath the drumbeat of his own heartbeat. He approached the driver's side, palm resting on his holstered weapon, a habit more than a necessity. The window slid down smoothly, and Darren found himself staring into the face of a man unlike what he expected. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Dark skin, sure, but his eyes, they weren't defiant or nervous or hostile. They were calm. Kind. Almost like he'd been expecting this moment, but held no malice for it. "License and registration," Darren snapped, falling into his role like a well-worn jacket. The man's hands moved with practiced slowness, no sudden jerks, no irritation. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" Darren didn't answer, already feeling a flicker of irritation at the man's composure. He liked it better when people squirmed. Made it easier to justify what came next. He scanned the interior of the car as the man produced his documents. Immaculate leather seats, no fast food wrappers or clutter, a briefcase resting on the passenger seat. The man handed over his ID. Malcolm Avery. The name meant nothing at first. Darren studied the license, then the man. Atlanta address. Clean cut. No visible reason to be out here on the edges of town. "What brings you through here, Mr. Avery?" Darren asked, his tone carrying an edge he didn't bother to soften. "I have a meeting nearby," Malcolm said, his voice steady, betraying neither fear nor annoyance. "I'm expected at the precinct." Darren's eyes narrowed. At his precinct? Now that was interesting. He radioed in the plate number, hoping for a hit. Nothing. No wants, no warrants, clean registration. "Step out of the vehicle," Darren ordered. Malcolm hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Not enough to count as resistance, but enough for Darren to notice. He saw the subtle set of the man's jaw, the flicker of weary resignation in his eyes, like someone who'd walked this road too many times to be surprised by it. "Is there a reason, officer?" Malcolm asked, his voice polite but carrying an undercurrent of quiet dignity. "Now," Darren barked, the sharpness in his voice more for himself than the man before him. Malcolm sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stepped out into the oppressive heat. Darren gestured to the hood of the SUV. Hands on the car. Malcolm complied without protest. Darren ran his hands down the man's sides, patting pockets, checking his waistband. Nothing. Wallet, phone, keys. Everything exactly where it should be. But still, Darren's mind itched. There had to be something. You ever been arrested, Mr. Avery? Darren asked, already knowing the answer. No, officer, Malcolm said, turning his head just slightly. In fact, I work in law enforcement myself. The words landed like a punch to Darren's gut. He froze, his hand still hovering near Malcolm's waist. He stared at the license again. The name clicked. A wave of cold sweat broke out under Darren's collar. Malcolm Avery. The new head of internal affairs for the state. The man every officer had been grumbling about for weeks, muttering curses in locker rooms and behind closed doors. The man brought in to clean up the department's worst habits. The man with the power to end careers. Darren took a shaky step back. I didn't realize, he stammered, his throat dry as dust. Malcolm straightened, adjusting his jacket with the grace of a man who'd endured worse indignities and survived them all. His eyes locked onto Darren's, not with the anger Darren expected, but with something far worse, disappointment. I imagine you didn't, Malcolm said softly. But that doesn't make it right. Darren's face burned. He opened his mouth to apologize, to excuse, but nothing came. He felt exposed, not just for this stop but for everyone like it. Every smug search. Every unnecessary detention. The weight of years pressed down on him. And then Malcolm did something Darren would never forget. He stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Darren could hear. You think I haven't met 100 men like you? Men who inherit hatred like a family heirloom. Who carry it like it's armor when it's really a chain. I know the stories you've been told. I know the fears you cling to. But let me ask you something, Officer Whitaker, when's the last time you asked yourself why? Why you see me as a threat? Why you reach for suspicion before reason? Darren's heart pounded. He thought of his father's words. Of old friends' jokes. Of his own tightening gut every time a face like Malcolm's crossed his path. He thought of the kid he pulled over last winter for nothing but a busted taillight, how he'd made the boy sit on the curb in the cold for an hour, just because he could. He thought about how easy it had always been. And now, for the first time, it felt unbearable. Malcolm shook his head, the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes. It's men like you that make this job harder than it should be. Not because you're evil. Not because you're a monster. But because you never stopped to question the lies you were handed. Darren swallowed hard. The air felt too thick, the sun too hot. I'm not here to destroy you, Darren, Malcolm continued. I'm here to fix a broken system. And that means fixing the people inside it. If you're willing. The words hung there, suspended in the sticky heat. Darren felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to look away but couldn't. And then Malcolm did the last thing Darren expected. He extended his hand. It was a simple gesture. No anger, no mockery. Just a man offering another man a choice. Darren's fingers trembled as he reached out, closing the distance. Their palms met, the contact electric in its significance. Darren's eyes stung. I'll see you at the precinct, Malcolm said quietly. And with that, he turned, climbed back into his SUV, and drove away. Darren stood there long after the car disappeared from view, the weight of years pressing down on him. His throat ached with unshed tears, his heart pounding a rhythm he didn't recognize. The world didn't shift in that moment. It didn't right itself. But something inside Darren cracked. And in the small, raw space left behind, a seed of something unfamiliar took root. Hope. And maybe, just maybe, the first faint glimmer of redemption. The sun was just beginning to dip when Darren finally made it home that evening. The sky stretched wide and painted itself in strokes of dusky orange and purple, and yet, to Darren, everything still felt grey. He parked his patrol car by the curb, sat there for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, and let the weight of the day settle onto his shoulders like a sodden coat. He had seen 100 sunsets in this town, driven these streets long enough to know every pothole, every sagging porch and cracked sidewalk. But that evening, it felt like he was seeing them for the first time. The world looked quieter, sadder. Or maybe it wasn't the world that had changed. Maybe it was him. He stepped onto his front porch, its paint peeling in strips like old bark, and sank onto the steps. The hum of cicadas filled the air, a chorus he'd tuned out for years, but now it seemed to surround him like a dirge. He watched the neighbors' kids chase fireflies across the lawn, their laughter high and sweet, and felt something in his chest tighten. Darren had spent so long walking around with a wall inside him that he didn't even realize it was there. He thought about Malcolm's words, not just the ones spoken on that sun-baked roadside, but the ones left unsaid. The heavy silence of a man who carried a lifetime of other people's prejudice on his back and still chose to extend his hand instead of his wrath. He remembered his own father, a man whose love felt more like obligation, whose advice came in the form of warnings, whose voice still haunted the back of Darren's mind with phrases like "know your place and don't trust M." His father had made fear a virtue and suspicion a survival skill. And Darren had followed the script, because what else did a boy do but try to become the man his father insisted he should be? But now he wondered how many people had paid the price for those inherited beliefs. How many quiet, dignified men like Malcolm he'd humiliated. How many kids like that boy last winter, made to sit in the cold, hearts pounding, because Darren carried a ghost on his shoulder whispering lies. The memories came in waves. A teenage boy pulled over for walking too late down the wrong block. A father searched in front of his crying children. A woman trembling as Darren ordered her out of her car for no reason he could defend now. Faces blurred together, a mosaic of all the people he'd made smaller so he could feel bigger. He let out a long, shuddering breath, and for the first time in years, Darren Whitaker cried. Not the silent kind of tears that sting the corners of your eyes and vanish, but the broken, heaving kind that shake your ribs and leave you gasping. He wept for what he'd done. For what he'd allowed himself to become. For what he'd never questioned. He sat there until the sky turned black, and the streetlights flickered to life. And when his tears dried, there was something else left in their place. A raw, unfamiliar ache. A need to be better. The next morning, Darren woke early. The light through his blinds was soft, the air cooler, the world feeling a fraction less heavy. He dressed in his uniform, not because he felt proud of it, but because today, it felt like something he needed to face. He drove to the precinct, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. As he stepped inside, the old smells of coffee, dust, and sweat clung to the air. Familiar faces nodded at him. Some smirked. A few officers gathered near the back traded jokes at the expense of someone unseen. Darren's stomach turned when he caught a snatch of conversation laced with a slur, and for the first time, it wasn't background noise. It was poison. He found Captain Ramirez in his office, the older man's brow furrowed over paperwork. Ramirez looked up, surprised to see Darren so early. "Whitaker," the captain grunted. "Didn't expect you this soon." Darren swallowed. "Sir, is Malcolm Avery here?" Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Internal affairs?" "Yeah, he's in the conference room. Reviewing case files." "What's this about?" Darren hesitated, his throat tight. "I need to speak with him." The captain leaned back, studying him. "You in some kind of trouble I don't know about?" Darren shook his head. "Not yet, sir. But it's time I stopped pretending." Without waiting for permission, Darren turned and made his way down the hall. The conference room door stood open, and there sat Malcolm, surrounded by folders and files. He looked up as Darren entered, his face unreadable. Darren closed the door behind him and stood there, the weight of years of bad choices pressing against his chest. "Officer Whitaker," Malcolm said evenly. "I came to apologize," Darren began, his voice rough. "Not just for yesterday. For everything. For the stops I made because of a face, for the fear I planted where none was deserved, for the power I abused. I came because I don't want to be that man anymore." The room was silent save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. "I was raised to be this way," Darren admitted. "Taught to see color before character. And I believed it because it was easier than asking why. But I'm asking now. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to start somewhere." Malcolm watched him, his gaze steady, searching. For a long moment, Darren thought maybe he'd be thrown out, reported, publicly shamed. But then Malcolm spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "Do you know how rare this is, Officer Whitaker? For a man to stand in front of another and name his mistakes without excuse." Darren's voice cracked. "I don't want to die a man my father would be proud of." A small, sad smile tugged at the corner of Malcolm's mouth. He gestured to a chair. "Sit." Darren obeyed. For the next hour, Malcolm spoke. Not like a superior dressing down a subordinate, but like a teacher to a student, like a man who had longed for someone to listen. He told Darren about his own years coming up through a system that saw him as a token, a quota, a threat. About the nights he was followed in neighborhoods he could afford to live in. About the way fear walked beside him, not for what he might do, but for what others might do to him. And yet, here he was, not bitter, not broken, but a man who had chosen to fight with grace instead of hatred. Darren listened. Really listened. Each story felt like a brick being pulled from the wall inside him. When the conversation ended, Malcolm rose and extended his hand again. Darren stood and took it, his grip firmer this time. "I can't change what you've done," Malcolm said quietly. "But you can change what you do next. I'll help you, if you're serious." "I am," Darren said, his voice hoarse. And from that day forward, Darren began to rebuild. He joined outreach programs, rode along with officers from neighborhoods he'd once feared, sat in meetings where people spoke of pain he'd helped cause, and he made himself listen. He challenged old friends, walked out of conversations that reeked of the old ways, and fought the urge to slip back into comfortable habits. It wasn't easy. It was messy, humbling, often lonely. The men he used to laugh with behind squad car doors called him soft, a traitor. Some stopped speaking to him altogether. But Darren had traded their approval for something better. He began to see the faces he'd once reduced to types, to stereotypes, as people with names and stories, families and fears. And though the road stretched long and unforgiving, each step he took made him lighter. One night, months later, Darren sat with Malcolm on a bench outside a community center after a meeting with at-risk youth. The sky was wide and starless, the air cool. "You know," Darren said, his voice quiet, "I used to think strength was about control. About having the upper hand. But you showed me it's about holding out your hand." Malcolm smiled, a quiet, weary thing. "The hardest thing you'll ever do, Darren, is unlearn what you were taught to believe about other people. And about yourself. But it's worth it." And in that moment, Darren knew it was. Because the real power wasn't in a badge or a weapon or the authority to take, but in the courage to give. To give grace. To give space. To give another man the dignity he was born with. And for the first time in his life, Darren Whitaker felt strong. Not because he was feared. But because he was better. And the world, for all its stubborn wounds, felt just a little more possible. Because sometimes, it only takes one person choosing humanity over hatred to turn the tide. And Darren vowed he would spend the rest of his life doing just that.